Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Shana Redmond, Professor of Music, Ethnomusicology, and African American Studies at UCLA. She's the author of several books: Anthem, Social Movements and the Sound of Solidarity in the African Diaspora, published by New York University Press, co-editor of Critical Ethnic Studies, A Reader, which is published by Duke University Press. She's the author of the brand new Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson, which was published this year by Duke University Press. And of Everything Man, Christina Scharf writes, formerly challenging and beautifully conceived, Everything Man is a model for scholarship and thinking, as well as a powerful addition to the body of work on Paul Robeson, freedom movement, sound studies, music, and beyond. It will make a tremendous impact. I guess in some ways, Professor Redmond, I want to describe you as the everything woman. Given the range of things that you cover in this book, but also kind of naturally in the body of scholarship that you produced thus far, talk a little bit about your travels to Paul Robeson and bringing Paul Robeson into the 21st century.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for having me. And thank you for, being so thoughtful and considerate of this work. It's been a really kind of fantastic journey to come into contact with Paul Robeson, which actually happened when I was in college initially. I had the distinct pleasure of taking a class from his granddaughter, Susan Robeson, who'd been invited to campus as a special guest. And it was a really interesting experience. Of course, one that I didn't take the fullest advantage of. I was 21 years old. I had never heard his name before. And it was a Black Studies course. So I was into it, but not fully kind of aware of the impact and lasting impression that he would actually make on me, but returned to him in my dissertation, which eventually became Anthem, where I focused on Old Man River. And it really was in doing the work for that project that I came to fall in love with this person more than a little bit. He was absolutely my favorite subject, my favorite ambassador from that project, just for the capaciousness of his thought, of his talent, of his ingenuity, of his commitments. And I knew that he was someone who was going to stick with me forever, although I had no idea, no intention of ever returning to him in my scholarship, at least not over any long form once Anthem was finished. So I had started an entirely new project, and I was doing research and just reading kind of wildly as I'm wont to do, and his name kept coming up. It was coming up in contemporary exhibits that I was paying attention to, the work of visual artists whom I was paying attention to. His music, of course, was something that was long lasting in my listening practice from the time of Anthem. And so his voice was constantly in circulation. I was going into the archive and bumping into him there, whether it be mention of him by some other Black radical from the 20th century, or whether it be some of his recordings.
But just like a Scottish American is proud of being from Scotland, I'm proud for being African. Now, in our school books, they tried to tell me that all Africans were savages, till I got to London and found most of the Africans I knew were going to Oxford and Cambridge and doing very well. It was wonderful to find about the colored peoples of the world that they were very advanced. So I would say today that I'm an American who is infinitely prouder to be of African descent, no question about it. No question about it.
The number of encounters I was having with him were just too plentiful for me to ignore. I actually had to pause what I thought I was doing and really sit down and listen to what he was trying to tell me. And what I found was that he hadn't gone anywhere. He is still a part of the common language that many of us speak, whether it be intellectuals, activists, artists. And I wanted to really take stock of why. Why is he back, and what work is he doing?
One of the things I appreciate about the book, Professor Redmond, is that it's not really a biography of Robeson. It's much more of an impressionistic view. And in many ways, even if as you examine various artists who have curated Paul Robeson. You're really curating Paul Robeson, for a 21st century audience, for a 21st century generation of activists and thinkers, writers, artists, who are trying to figure out a way to grapple with this particular historical moment.
Yeah, and that really was the point. I was trying to have a conversation with contemporary movement collectives, the artists who are inspired by them and inspire these movements in turn, the intellectuals who are trying to write the narrative, the public intellectuals, because I do see this as a very present story. He is still part and parcel of how we understand our living in the present moment. And so to think about him in conversation with all of these artists who are bringing him to life through these various scales was really important to me. So the project of the book, or the organization of it in some respects, is to think about him as an evolution, to think about him from his very elemental nature, the kind of composite portrait of him through these various techniques and kind of singularities, and to grow him into vibration. And it's really an effort to assess the longue durée of his influence and the ways in which he has become available to most everyone with any requests that they might make of him.
Yeah. What's interesting about Robeson, trying to figure out a way to translate him to a younger generation of folks. Because in some way in which he's such an original, there was such an abundance, even an overabundance of talents and passions, right? So to explain someone who's a valedictorian of his college class, who at the same time is an All-American football player, right, who then moves on to the concert stage, right, and then becomes this incredible radical, both in terms of being an orator, but also in terms of a writer. There really is no model, for Paul Robeson, right? There wasn't one before him, and there's really no example of him that can exist now, at least as we know, the folks who are out there doing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously there are people who are picking up elements of his, who are taking on certain characteristics of his, and using him as inspiration in their own practice. And that's valiant work. To be even, a tenth as talented as Paul Robeson, I would count myself lucky, but I think you're right. We don't have a model for someone like Paul Robeson. And so the language of everything man, I think, I would early on, and even in the later stages of the project, as I was workshopping it with people, folks would kind of query, first, where is this language coming from? And of course, it's inspired by the song by Daybreak, about this, fantastic man who's willing to come rescue and save and be present with people whenever he's called. But the language of it, everything man, while a bit playful, is as close as I can imagine getting to describing this person, right? He was good at everything, and it's just amazing to kind of sit with the fact that this person walked the earth.
When you were writing Everything Man, and even after its publication, we lived in a very different world than the one that we do now. So much has, I won't say changed, but shifted. Definitely some of the language has shifted. Some of the politics have shifted, over the last 4 or 5 months. How is your thinking about Paul Robeson shifted as we're watching these other shifts occur, in American society?
I think my thinking on him has remained relatively static in recognizing how significant he actually is for our times. But I do think in moments such as this, where we're facing the redeployment of fascism, where we're facing the possibility of war making, either at the kind of localized domestic level against Native and Indigenous populations, for example, or as we're seeing escalations elsewhere in the world. Robeson was an anti-fascist. He was a radical peace activist. He was all of these things in ways that had material impact on the political discourse of his time. And so I do see him very much aligned with the efforts to unsettle the ways in which a certain type of soft fascism in the lead up to this moment became common sense for some people, right? That it was just a part of our everyday lives. And so to have someone like Robeson come back into our public thinking as a way to radically disrupt that common sense, I think is really crucial. So we should be returning to his oratory. We should be returning to the document that he helped deliver to the UN, We Charge Genocide in 1951. We should be returning to all of these things. The singing that he did on the battlefront in the Spanish Civil War against fascism. And we should be using it in our organizing, in our intellectual work, but certainly in our movements in the world as citizens.
To shift a little bit for a moment, you clearly are someone who has an activist lineage, if you will, right? See yourself as an activist, obviously you see yourself as a public scholar, but you actually are an academic also. And so thinking a bit about this particular moment, and even in consideration of Robeson, as a scholar of African American studies, and not necessarily commenting on your African American studies department, what do you think are the challenges going forward, for these departments, for these structures, and particularly at some place like a UCLA, the huge public institution that in many ways was already under assault for resources prior to this moment, right? But now post-COVID is almost doubly under assault in this regard. What's the way forward for these programs and departments?
I think that's a huge question. And it's something certainly that I've been thinking about. I have a PhD in African American studies, so this has never been far from my thinking, whether it be when I was going on the job market up until this very moment where I happen to be part of a department that is struggling in many different ways. And I think that being at a public institution for the first time in my career has brought a different valence of consideration to that question. So thinking about the austerity politics that attend to this moment, not just for publics, but especially for public institutions, we are, as our mandate claims, a public good. Right? And if we are, in fact, a public good, then we have to be manifesting, supporting, amplifying the work that is most urgent at the present. And I would argue that the humanistic inquiry into the conditions and power dynamics of Blackness is a public good. It absolutely is fundamental to how we have to understand our contemporary moment. So part of my thinking in how we best position ourselves is, first of all, to refuse austerity politics, right? To refuse the scarcity model. And it doesn't mean that we'll receive all of the financial resources that we warrant, but it does mean that there are ways to use the resources we have to better collectivize as faculty, as thought producers, as people engaged in community. There are far better ways for us to be using the resources that we do have, while at the same time putting pressure on these institutions to actually take seriously what has now become such common language around Black Lives Matter. If you believe that, then it means certain things. And it doesn't just mean more Black faces on campus, as important as that is. It actually means a fundamentally different relationship to the world, which for my purposes means divesting from policing completely. It means actually putting resources into the community, not just through kind of flashy PR opportunities. It means under-recognized, quiet types of investments that are sustainable and guided first by those communities of which we see ourselves part. There are so many ways for us to be doing the work that is required of us in Black studies. And I think we've only tapped into a small portion of that potential.
Yeah, thinking about your own work and practice for a moment, I've come to really value your mind, but I also very much value your ears. And so what have you been listening to in this moment? I was struck early on during the COVID, some of the things that you would share on social media, just in terms of playlists that were getting you through that quarantine moment. But as that quarantine moment shifted into this other thing, what's the music that you found yourself going back to time and time again?
Yeah, I think, I've been returning to some classics for sure. I've actually been thinking a lot about Mary J. Blige of recent, in part
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
I have a discussion with her coming up, not with her, but of her coming up in the very near future. But, definitely returning to, Black on Both Sides, returning to various of the soul classics, the We Insist suite,
Hmm.
as a
Hmm.
means
Hmm.
of actually getting myself back into the genealogies that give me some perspective, but also give me some hope. It's a moment where so much of our judgment can be clouded, or we can lose perspective as far as what are the options available to us, what might our futures actually become. And so I want to make sure, as I already know Black music does, that I'm tapping into that lifeline. But I've also been listening to Ben Williams, who's a jazz soul singer and has been doing some covers, rethinking some covers of various songs like We Shall Overcome, for example, which he did a really interesting cover of. And, trying to be thoughtful about the types of musicians who are under-recognized in this moment, but who are trying to use their musical practice as a means of responding really capaciously to this moment. But it's always a process. I'm returning to some things that are, just comfortable. Like after WAP came out, I had to listen to the original house track over and over and over again, right?
Right.
Like I have to settle back into just feeling my body, feeling the vibrations of the moment, being attuned to those things that make me happy, in
Yeah.
addition to
Right.
speaking to me with a political language that I can
Yeah.
identify and kind of attune myself again to. So it's both, as you know, right? It's the pleasure and the joy alongside the urgently political that's actually most sustaining.
Yeah. For you as a parent, how has it been trying to navigate, both the natural urges around safety that are contained in the quarantine moment, but also trying to manage this really distinct political moment that we're dealing with this moment also?
Thank you for that question. It's hard. It's really, really hard. My babe is 2 years old, just recently. And, you know, um, there are the real material questions of being full time in the home with them
Mm-hmm.
right now,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and trying to still be a full time worker,
Mm-hmm.
and how to
Mm-hmm.
manage and negotiate all of that. But then the real curiosity, the real weight is trying to imagine a future where they come out of this first, hopefully not having known it ever happened, right? Until they're old enough to
Mm-hmm.
understand it. So to keep everything as playful and immediate, as present as I possibly can be as a parent. But it's also about creating an environment and a language that can grow with them around why we're so valuable, why we matter as individuals, but more than that, why we matter as a community. What are the talents, what are the visions that we're bringing to the world, and why is it that some people are afraid of those visions? Why do people try to stop our movements? Why do people try to hurt us? And so really giving them a sense of who they are in the world before they're confronted with a version of themselves that they did not create. And that's, the thoughtful work, the ongoing future
Yeah.
work of being a Black parent and raising a Black child. And it's scary. It's really, really scary. And, it's work for me as an individual to have a thoughtfulness about myself such that I can help them to develop and imagine that future.
What's coming down the line for you, Professor Redmond? Because I know you're always busy, always got ideas.
Always busy. Yeah, so I am writing a book that is kind of a memoir of my relationship to the prison. My father was incarcerated for about a decade. And so it's a project where I'm thinking along with him and through the institution around Blackness, about the kinds of relationships that exist through those walls and the meaning making opportunities that come from those situations. But I'm also writing a scholarly project now about the possible impossible in Black music. So how Black musicians throughout the 20th and 21st century have disrupted the emplotment of impossibility, and really taking a cue from all of the fantastic, incredible, unbelievable musical feats that we have created over the last 2 centuries. And I'm super excited to jump into it.
Yeah, I was really moved. You had posted a photo of you and your father a few days ago on social media. And part of the point of the photo was that, y'all were having an argument, right? Y'all were having a discussion that your father is still an interlocutor for you, and one that matters. And I think it's so important for us to see those images, particularly for folks who are post the experience, but also the idea that, in a world in which, Black fathers are disappeared and obscured, yet another example of a Black father who's there and vibrant and engaged, and still creating relationships that matter, particularly for Black daughters.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact is that he was doing that while he was incarcerated too, right? And I think that's part of my point with the project, is that there was no time lost. As difficult as it was, as many formative moments as he missed, as I missed, as much as we struggled to maintain that relationship, there was nothing but intimacy all throughout that process. And I think that giving some language and some thought to that experience, as difficult as it will be for me in the writing of it, I think is really, really crucial. It's both in homage to him for having survived it and for having modeled for me how to survive. But it is also an offering to my child to know who this person is, who their grandfather is, and how strong and resilient he and we are.
Thank you. Again, we've been joined by Professor Shana Redmond, Professor of Musicology and African American Studies at UCLA, the author of the wonderful new book, Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson. It is always a joy and a pleasure to talk with you, Professor Redmond.
Thank you, sir. I always enjoy it.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every Black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All Black